What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and the trailer for Miss Marvel has dropped. Now, in 2015, we did a video called Marvel Comics, Kamala Khan, Miss Marvel Explained. But because her character had only been out for about a year, that video was more of an origin. So I basically just retitled it to Marvel Comics, Kamala Khan's Origin Explained, right? And that's really it. We'll put hashtags and everything in there. But it was basically a 20-minute video covering her origin. So if you guys only care about her origin, that's the video that you can check out. We'll cover her origin too, just not necessarily in the same amount of depth. But regardless, the character of Kamala Khan was created by Willow Wilson and first appeared in Miss Marvel Volume 3, Issue number 1, back in 2014. Now, undoubtedly, those of you all who are sort of going through and aren't really familiar with comics or learning about all this kind of stuff, you might find yourself where you're a little confused because Carol Danvers was Miss Marvel, now she's Captain Marvel. How does Kamala Khan fit into all this? Which, just FYI, over the course of this video, I may end up calling Kamala Khan Kamala Harris a couple times, right? Just fair warning ahead of time, right? It may happen. The reality was that Carol Danvers as Miss Marvel, she was okay, but she hadn't really been relevant for something like 40 years. I mean, she was one of those characters where, because she was drawn in a really, really sexual way, like boys loved her, right? Like guy fans loved her, but there really wasn't anything about her character that drew interest from female readers. And so what you ended up getting was probably one of the absolute best Carol Danvers stories ever written by Kelly Sue DeConnick, which was called Captain Marvel Higher, Further, Faster, right? It's Captain Marvel Volume 1. What it did is it basically took Carol Danvers away from simply being quote-unquote Miss Marvel, and she adopted the name of Captain Marvel, which had belonged to a few characters over the years, but the most notable was Marvel of the Kree, which worked because it was due to like the Psych Magnetron and the fact that Carol Danvers' powers were basically a copy of the original Marvel's powers, that she ended up becoming who she was. And so the reality is, following that point, Carol Danvers just simply became known as Captain Marvel. What this did is it left a vacancy, if Marvel chose to use it, for the name of Miss Marvel. And so Willow Wilson basically took that mantle and gave it to a girl named Kamala Khan. Now, the way this played out in her original appearance, because it wasn't really until Volume 4 that we ended up getting like any measurable origin beyond what we saw here initially. In the original origin for her character, the way it played out is that she was a byproduct of the Terrigen bomb. Now, for those of you guys who aren't really familiar with that, during Jonathan Hickman's Avengers, the New Avengers, best comic book story ever told, there was a story that was called Infinity, where basically Thanos invaded the Earth looking for a son. He ended up getting into a conflict with the Inhumans, and in probably one of the best comic book fights ever, he ended up fighting Black Bolt of the Inhumans, who was basically the Inhuman king. During this conflict, Black Bolt detonated the Terrigen bomb, which basically spread the Terrigen mist across the world. Whenever an Inhuman is exposed to the Terrigen mist, they develop powers. The powers are based on whatever their previously created genealogy was, and that's not necessarily important here. The important thing is that for Kamala Khan, she gained her powers because she was basically in the wrong place at the wrong time. She had snuck out of her house, ignoring the directions of her parents, which of course we'll talk about that whole familiar relationship here in a minute, since that's the really, really important part of her character's storytelling, as well as her friend Bruno, and then tried to go to a party in order to, hang out with her friends and so on. And again, the kind of character mannerisms of her, those were important, so we'll talk about those here in a minute. But the result of this is that on her way back, the Terrigen mist had basically hit her, right? She had just kind of been engulfed by them. And when that took place, much like virtually all Inhumans, she had a cocoon that was formed around her, and then from there, it was really metatextual. She had this vision where she essentially met with like what she considered to be her three favorite superheroes. So like Captain America, Carol Danvers, of course, and then Iron Man. The reality is that Carol Danvers was the one that she had always idolized, and that was really Willow Wilson establishing Kamala Khan as essentially a stand-in for young female readers, right? That with Carol Danvers becoming Captain Marvel, becoming very much this sort of step up from where she was before. She wasn't just some girl who was walking around in like a one piece, right, drawn in a very voluptuous way, but instead was a woman who had a position of authority, a position of power, which she was never afraid to exercise. That Kamala Khan was designed to be the girl who just went into a comic book store and wanted to see more women in comics in roles of leadership. And so the result of this is that while she did talk to Captain America, did talk to Iron Man, it was really the conversation with Carol Danvers that was the most significant. But the truth about this is that because it was only really a vision, it was really more her subconscious or even her conscience that was having a conversation with her, right? Just kind of basically telling her like, it's you shouldn't have ignored your parents, different things along those lines. But what Willow Wilson did was also something really, really, really cool. The nature of being a teenager is such that your life is an existential crisis. You don't know who you are, you don't know where you're going, you don't know what you're about, you know nothing about yourself. and even then, sometimes we never get past that existential crisis stage, right? Like over over the course of our lives, like, I didn't figure myself out until I was 30, right? I had no idea what I wanted in this life until I was like 30 or 31. Sometimes it just takes that long to figure it out. And that was the other part of the conversation that was being had here was, what do you want in this life, Kamala Khan? Like, what's important to you? Now, the reason why this conversation was so significant was because leading up to the point where she was exposed to the Terrigen Mist, one of the big things that was established is that she was of Pakistani origin and that her family was very, very traditional insofar as familial ties, rules laid down by the parents, which the children obey, different things along those lines. And so it was one of those situations where, and again, we'll kind of talk about this a little bit later, she was at a kind of fork in the road where she wanted to make a choice about what kind of life she wanted to live, but she wasn't entirely sure what she wanted to do. And so what she did is she simply said, like, she wanted to be more like Captain Marvel. She wanted to be more like Carol Danvers, who she described as just being beautiful and amazing and just all these things that were really just adjectives designed to show that she looked up to the character. And so what ended up happening is that following the end of her vision, so to speak, and the Terrigen Mist kind of running their course and her gaining her powers and emerging from the cocoon, that she was essentially able to control her body on the molecular level. Now, the reason why this matters is because whenever it comes to a person's ability to control their body or individual things on the atomic or the molecular level, you're only ever one step away, right? One story arc, one power expansion from being able to do that on like a planetary or even a universal level. Atoms don't change. Molecules don't change. The things that make up molecules change, right? The atoms that compose molecules, that changes over time. But the nature is that atoms themselves do not change. And so the truth is being able to manipulate molecules is being able to manipulate atoms. And if you can manipulate atoms, you can do virtually anything. The reason why I say this is because Kamala Khan can basically alter the structure of her own body on the molecular level. And her powers have really seen bits of expansion here and there, but we're all just kind of waiting for that point where some story arc takes place and then she's able to like alter the biosphere or something crazy like that, right? Just something absolutely nuts. But by and large, her powers were very, very similar and still are very similar to Reed Richards of the Fantastic Four, right? Mr. Fantastic, the ability to stretch, the ability to expand her mass, different things along those lines. And so following this and really kind of returning home, what it did is it allowed G. Willow Wilson to set the stage for probably one of the coolest elements of Kamala Khan, right? This whole idea being that now she was very much a kind of Spider-Man-esque character. You know, that as a teenager, she was trying to fit in, she had her friend Bruno, and she was trying to be cool, but now also trying to figure out how to use her powers at the exact same time. Now, of course, once she got home and basically Bruno had spilled the beans on what had gone on and her parents found out that she had snuck out, she was grounded for what basically felt like forever, right? When you're a teenager and you're grounded, a week is an eternity, right? I mean, you guys know, like, you guys have all been there before, like, it sucks. But it's one of those things where it just kind of felt like forever. Now, following this, and really over the first 7 issues or so of Kamala Khan's stories, there were a few things that was happening. And in fact, it was a really interesting change of pace from what you normally saw, right? Even now to this day, in a lot of ways, the old Stan Lee, Jack Kirby method is still used in Marvel Comics, which is to say, introduce a new character and then shop them around the Marvel Universe in order to get people familiar with them, right? So have them team up with the Fantastic Four or appear in a Fantastic Four comic. Have them team up with Captain America or team up with Spider-Man or something along those lines, right? Comics that are established that you know people read so that you can introduce this character to an audience that either didn't know they existed or didn't really see a reason to read them in the first place, in the hopes that the nature of that character as they're depicted in the comics would resonate with the reader who had never read their comics, so that reader would now start reading their comics. And so the result of this is that a few things happen. The first is that dealing with more of the personality traits of Kamala Khan and dealing with the various issues she was going through as a teenager, a young girl trying to figure out her place in the world, which was now complicated by the addition of powers, that of course she and Bruno had a bit of a falling out because of the fact that Bruno had basically made her parents aware of what was going on. Bruno was coming from a place of concern. He didn't really want her to get hurt. He didn't want anything bad to happen to her. But at the end of the day, it felt like a betrayal. So there was that sort of character theme, which of course led to the two of them reconciling because they're friends, right? You can't stay mad at your friend forever. And then in turn, it was also her trying to become a superhero. Now, the reality of this, and this is one of those things that again made it pretty cool, is that there wasn't really anybody to guide her, right? It was very similar to Spider-Man, right? Back when Peter Parker first became Spider-Man in the 60s, he didn't really have a tutor. There really wasn't anybody who took him under their wing and said, we're going to teach you how to be a superhero, Spider-Man. Instead, he was flying by the seat of her pants. And while Kamala Khan was not like the first person to go through that entire concept after Spider-Man, a lot of people had, it was really cool to see that that concept was still alive and well in Marvel Comics. And so she was basically trying to figure herself out. And she had a few small little things here and there, right? Fighting against some villain called the Inventor, and then learning that she had a secondary power, that whenever she was in her quote-unquote superhero superhero form, that if she was injured, which as she was, she had basically been attacked, that she could revert back to her normal form and it would heal. So kind of a healing factor to a degree, not in the traditional sense like Wolverine, but nonetheless, it was really more akin to like Iceman. Like if Bobby Drake is injured in his ice form, he can revert to his human form and basically be fine. Or if he's in his human form and he's injured, he can turn into his ice form, back into his human form, and everything's basically copacetic, right? That kind of a situation. But what you also saw was her trying to track down somebody called the Inventor, who was just really small time, not enough for the Avengers or anybody to care about, but the perfect kind of villain for someone like Kamala Khan, who's basically brand new to the superhero scene. It was a weird thing where like this guy Gregory Knox had tried to clone his bird, and then you ended up getting like this giant hybrid bird, right? And it was weird. It was just this great big huge weird thing. Ended up leading to a fight in the sewers and that kind of stuff. But she was ultimately saved by Wolverine, and then fighting alongside Wolverine, they actually ended up defeating like these just monstrous alligators and so on. Again, not a great big huge set of events, which is good. It's not as though she first appeared and then she was immediately out in space fighting Thanos alongside the Avengers and the Fantastic Four. It wasn't really anything like that. Instead, G. Willow Wilson's take was gradually introduce people to the character. The more important thing that she was doing was introducing people to the personality of Kamala Khan and getting people to care about her personality. Now, the reason why that was done, for those of you all who are unfamiliar with comics, is that it's not hard to craft an event where like things are popping off and people are fighting. That's super easy to do. What's hard to do in comics is create a character with a personality that's written in such a way to where you're interested in them. The other part of this is that G. Willow Wilson had realized there wasn't really a lot of Pakistani representation in Marvel Comics, or even in comics in general, unless you were reading something written by independent writers. And so adding that element and like the familial aspects and things like that, or giving people a general perception of what Pakistani life is like for a Pakistani girl living in America, was one thing that really resonated with a lot of young readers. And in fact, it was really a core part of her character, because what you saw in the early days with Kamala Khan was basically her struggling with like the independence and the freedom and the non-traditional elements of American life. Because one of the things you saw was Kamala Khan dealing with these struggles of the traditional nature of her Pakistani family conflicting with more differing ideologies of the American system, right? The American societal system. And so there was a lot of bumping heads there, right? She wanted to live the life that a lot of young Americans do, which in a lot of ways conflicted with the life that her parents were trying to get her to live. And so it was one of those really interesting concepts, because it really again resonated with a lot of people. Now again, one of the things that we've talked about in previous videos where we've covered characters who appeared between 2014 and 2015 is that Marvel was wrapping things up, right? Remember, there was the whole event of Secret Wars in 2015, the collapse of the multiverse, the end of all things. So within a year of Kamala Khan appearing in Marvel Comics, the idea that like Medusa and Black Bolt of the Inhumans were basically issuing an invitation, not so much forcing, but issuing an invitation for those various people out there who had been transformed and learned that they were Inhumans to join the Inhuman Society in Attilan. That while there was this idea of Wolverine contacting Medusa in order to keep an eye on Kamala Khan, again, that happened in issue number 7, that the reality is that G. Willow Wilson was focusing more on the character than great big huge events, because that's all she really could do, right? That like things were coming to an end, right? Things were wrapping up. The multiverse was ending, and we knew that we were going to end up going into either a reboot or a reshuffling of everything. And so what we ended up getting is that in Secret Wars 2015, the multiverse was destroyed, right? It was completely eradicated due to the results of the White Lords of Wild Space, right? The Beyonders, and like the Molecule Man Owen Reese and the Illuminati and all that kind of stuff. It all ended up going belly up. And so what we got following that was the return of the multiverse that was all basically restored by Reed Richards, his son Franklin Richards, who can alter reality on a universal level, kind of a universal shaper as he was described, and the Molecule Man Owen Reese. And so what this did is it saw the launch of something called All New, All Different Marvel, which I'm sure a lot of you all saw. And it wasn't really all new or all different. It was just a name that Marvel used in order to get people to buy the comics. So the thing about this is that following that, while G. Willow Wilson did return and you did get Miss Marvel Volume 4, because of the fact that the origin era had basically passed, a majority of her appearances were really confined to the Avengers. And while I wouldn't say she had become irrelevant, while you did have her solo series, in terms of the Avengers, she was just there, right? And she just did some stuff, and some things happened, and then the story was over, and that was basically it. There wasn't really a whole lot going on. However, one of the big things that was taking place during that time is Marvel was setting the stage for the idea of the champions. And the reason for this is that within the first 3 issues of All New, All Different Avengers, you actually ended up seeing a kind of team up between Kamala Khan and Sam Alexander, who was the newest iteration of Nova and one of the most fun characters ever in the history of Marvel Comics. I love Sam Alexander. He's so amazing. I can't wait till we get him in the MCU. It's only a matter of time. He's like this teenage kid who has the power to like go into space and fight threats, right? He's part of the Nova Corps, right? So it's really, well, at least his dad was. And then like his whole origin story was like the hunt for his dad and all that kind of cool stuff. But the thing about this is that the two of them ended up teaming up. And in fact, Sam Alexander had actually tried to flirt with Kamala Khan and tried to like hit on her a few times. And between her being just sort of socially awkward and the fact that they're like, we're kind of fighting a threat, now's not really the time for flirting, she ultimately rebuffed it. Now, following that, you actually saw the all-new, all-different Avengers, or at least these younger characters, teaming up yet again when you saw Miles Morales being brought in, and Miles and Nova and Kamala Khan facing off against yet another threat. Now, again, this is one of those instances where people sort of look at all-new, all-different Marvel as, in a lot of ways, just an era of debacle storytelling. Because following that, you basically had a series of events that were written by Marvel that were designed to do nothing than be cash grabs for like the Marvel Cinematic Universe. So where the original Civil War by Mark Miller is kind of considered to be a masterpiece just based on like the sheer depth and everything that was happening with regards to the superhero community, Civil War 2 was the opposite of that. That it was basically a cash grab that sucked. And so for the most part, you ended up seeing like a few things, like nothing really significant happened except that like Tony Stark died. Everybody saw Carol Danvers as a dick. Well, depending on who you're talking to, people saw it as character assassination for Carol Danvers. And then Miles Morales, quote unquote, killing Captain America. It was that kind of a thing, right? There were a few things that were going on here and there, but it was really more shock value as opposed to it having any real value in any form or fashion. And so with the second Civil War event basically wrapping up, coming to a close, what it did is it led to, in a lot of ways, Kamala Khan and Miles Morales and Sam Alexander and a lot of these guys really just kind of being disenchanted with the nature of the Avengers. And so they ultimately defected. And what they ended up doing is with Nova and Spider-Man quitting, you ended up having Kamala Khan who did the same thing. And a lot of this was because looking around at the events of Civil War, looking at the collateral damage, looking at all the things that had gone on, that these three had basically come to the conclusion that in essence, the Avengers didn't care about the small people. They didn't care about the little things, right? The person walking down the road or the collateral damage that was done. It was one of those where in years past, well, damage control takes care of all that, right? That's basically it. Damage control will make them whole. We're really sorry your aunt and uncle died. But hey, you know, it's just part of living in New York. I don't know what to tell you, right? That was just the general gist of the Avengers for the most part. And so ultimately the champions were formed as an answer to the question, what group out there is going to help take care of the small people? And the champions were amazing. The champions were always awesome. And in fact, I loved the concept of the champions in Marvel Comics. Now, something that I do want to point out here is that the champions were not just these three, right? It was not just Nova and Miles and Kamala Khan. Instead, what you also ended up getting added onto the team was Amadeus Cho, who was the 8th smartest person in the world, who'd become the newest iteration of the Incredible Hulk following basically the death of Bruce Banner. You got the Vision's daughter, Vivian, who was cool, but always a little bit sketchy. And then you had the time-displaced Cyclops. Now, the time-displaced Cyclops was really a bigger part with regards to the time-displaced X-Men. The idea that like everything going on with Cyclops at the time and everything going on with the X-Men at the time was such that Beast had felt like the team had lost their way. So he had traveled into the past, grabbed the younger versions of themselves, brought them to the modern era in order to try to bring the X-Men back to who they were supposed to be. And then the team just never left. And honestly, they stopped being cool after about 3 story arcs. So people were just kind of like, okay, I mean, whatever. But like putting the younger Cyclops, the time-displaced Cyclops on that team was a great way to kind of keep him relevant to a degree until we were waiting for the original Cyclops to come back from the dead after his supposed death. Now, depending on who you're talking to, some people will say the biggest issue with the champions is that they were basically like a social justice warrior team, right? That there was a point in Marvel Comics following All New, All Different Marvel, and even part of All New, All Different Marvel, where in a lot of ways there was a lot of political storytelling. You guys may remember that. It was a very divisive time among the fan base in Marvel. I always enjoyed that era of the champions. I will say that Jim Zub's run in Champions Volume 3 was particularly interesting because what you saw was that while the team originally consisted of only a handful of people, what you ended up getting was the team basically going worldwide. That you actually ended up seeing like Falcon and Patriot and like the new Power Man and these characters basically given membership, and then in turn, it was like a champions team around the world, right? So in a lot of ways, it was similar to like Batman Incorporated, for those of you guys who are familiar with Grant Morrison's Batman run, but basically like that whole thing, right? It was very similar to that. And it was great for what it was. It was absolutely phenomenal. We can cover champions at some point or even do like a champions explained, right? Because that requires a whole great big huge thing. But the reality is that Kamala Khan was way more interesting when she was on the champions than she ever was in terms of her solo series. Because by this point in time, G. Willow Wilson had long since left writing. And so it was one of those things where it was kind of like people weren't able to really capture the character in a way that G. Willow Wilson was, because Willow Wilson was a Pakistani woman writing about a Pakistani character. And unless you're able to specifically identify with the character that you're writing, you will ultimately end up being, kind of losing the element of that character, right? Losing the core thing that makes them exceedingly relatable. And so because of this, in 2020, or at least January of 2020, Miss Marvel's comic, which had already been retitled to The Magnificent Miss Marvel, was axed by Marvel. They ended up canceling it. And instead, what they did is they shifted the focus of Kamala Khan over to the Champions. So the Champions comic itself was in a lot of ways one part focusing on the team, but then also giving a little more emphasis to the character of Kamala Khan than anybody else. And that's the reason why once the events of the Secret Empire storyline kicked off, there was a lot of emphasis put on the individual events going on with Kamala Khan, as opposed to seemingly anything else. That what ended up happening here is that, for those of you guys who are unfamiliar with Secret Empire, this basically led to the Red Skull capturing a cosmic cube. I mean, it was really predicated on like Avengers Standoff and like Pleasant Hill and all that kind of stuff, but basically a cosmic cube had been taken by the Red Skull, and really it had reformed in Cubic. I can never remember her name. There's the original, which I think is Kobik, and then there's the modern one, which I think is Cubic. But basically it was a little girl who was young and naive, right? A cosmic cube that really kind of followed the form and function of just a young, inexperienced girl. And the Red Skull had manipulated her into altering the reality of Captain America and really altering the universe itself. And so what this basically meant is Captain America's entire history was rewritten so that Steve Rogers never became Captain America, or at least he did, but the entire time he was basically a secret operative for Hydra. Nobody really knew, right? He had just been a Hydra agent who had been sent, or who had lived in the United States and had become Captain America, all the while working to ensure that Hydra would come to power. Now, eventually he took out the Red Skull, succeeded the Red Skull, took over Hydra itself, and then launched Secret Empire. And that was basically him conquering the United States and then actually having his sights set on the world, which he successfully conquered the states. But for the story of Kamala Khan herself within Champions, what you ended up learning is that because anybody out there who was like an Inhuman or something like that had basically been rounded up and put in internment camps, it was really her and even a few other members of the Champions operating as basically freedom fighters, right? They were almost kind of like a modern day freedom force, right? For those of you guys who remember, not really government sanctioned, but in terms of the form and function, but essentially traveling around and like rescuing members of the Inhuman community who had been, put in concentration camps, right? Liberating them in a lot of ways. And so it was really, really cool to see that element maintained. And of course, the aspect of Bruno and her familiar relations and different things along those lines, those still remained intact. But for the most part, Champions focused more on the superhero element of Kamala Khan than it did on the familial ties and things like that. A lot of the interpersonal struggles outside of the team and really just regarding her family kind of fell to the background. And so what you have going on right now in Marvel Comics regarding the Champions is the Underage Superhero Registration Act and basically Cradle. Now, Cradle is the Child Hero Reconnaissance and Disruption Law Enforcement Division, right? Organization, essentially. But the way this went down is that the reality as far as the world was concerned is that having teenagers fight as superheroes was just too big of a risk, right? Like, teenagers are naturally reckless. When you add in superpowers and seemingly no thought to the consequences, it can lead to a terrible situation. And this played out in the events of Outlawed. Now, the way the Outlawed storyline played out was that you basically ended up having like Roxxon, they're like if Amazon and Facebook were the same company, right? Just like really, really shady and doing terrible things. That they kind of unleashed an Asgardian dragon. And when that happened, you ended up seeing Kamala Khan basically bring back, or at least assemble, the Champions who had not necessarily been canceled or been removed, but had just kind of been out there doing their own thing as individuals, unofficially operating as a team. And when that happened, Vision's daughter exploded, which actually was very similar to the events of Nitro in the original Civil War storyline. During that time, you had Senator Joffrey Patrick, who's really more of like a modern day Robert Kelly, that basically ended up passing Kamala's law. Basically a law that said any person under the age of 21 cannot operate as a superhero unless they're being monitored by an experienced adult. And so when Kamala Khan woke up, she was pissed because somebody had passed a law like that in her name, basically banning her. She had spoken publicly on quote-unquote behalf of the Champions, which created even more issues because the Champions didn't want someone speaking for her because not all of them disagreed with the passage of the law. And so ultimately what ended up happening, or at least where things stand at the moment, is that in the middle of one of their meetings, Cradle had basically invaded, snatched a whole bunch of them up, and Kamala Khan was able to make her escape. We don't really know exactly how this is going to play out, but it is pretty cool, right? Outlawed is a pretty cool storyline. But that's kind of the explanation of Kamala Khan. Again, there is a lot of stuff that we left out because we simply just don't have time. We'll probably start covering like more Miss Marvel stuff as we get closer to the release of the TV show in June. description. But if you guys enjoyed this video, drop a like. Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.